in your gross domestic product, then it is more likely that you will experience a violent civil conflict. Okay, well, the big question here, of course, is the so what question. So what is the causal mechanism? It's all good and well to demonstrate these correlations, but why is this happening? What is the causal mechanism? And political scientists and economists tend to fall back on their respective theoretical and disciplinary proclivities in explaining causality. So, for political scientists, resource conflict, this phenomenon of resource conflict in developing country context, is seen as a form of the resource curse, a kind of political form of Dutch disease. And political scientists, point to things like rent-seeking behavior in the context of poor governance, the fact that if a government is deriving a lot of revenue from extractive resource industries, and there's no need to tax citizens or to develop robust independent bureaucracies. And political scientists, point to the lure of resource wealth, encouraging armed challenges to the state, which it's poorly equipped to deal with. Now, for economists, and particularly for a fellow called Paul Collier and his colleagues, and Paul Collier is at Oxford University, and for many years was providing very influential advice to the World Bank. And Paul Collier and his colleagues, after conducting a number of these kind of econometric studies, have explained, causality very much in terms of kind of neoclassical economic frameworks around rational actor models of behavior, and what we might call methodological individualism. So Collier et al. Have argued that civil wars are not caused by objective grievances such as inequality or political repression, but rather by the greed of those who wage them. And Collier et al. Have put forward two versions of this hypothesis, this greed hypothesis. In the weak version, the presence of what they refer to as lootable commodities, and the paradigmatic case is the kind of diamond wars of sub-Saharan Africa. So the presence of diamonds provides the opportunity to fund rebellion, right? So rebel groups capture the territory in which the diamond trade takes place, and they use the proceeds, the loot, to fund their rebellion. In the stronger version, the capture of the loot itself becomes the primary motive for rebellion. So this is the strong version of the greed thesis. Okay, so I'm going to pause here before returning for the second part of the lecture. So see you in a minute. Okay, so I'm back again, and in the second part of the lecture, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be talking about the value, as I see it, of a political ecology perspective on natural resource conflicts, and I'm going to be applying this perspective to the conflicts in both Bougainville and in Solomon Islands. Now, as you can probably imagine, the greed not grievance thesis was enormously controversial and really created a furor among social scientists who have an interest in this phenomenon of developing country conflict. And the hypothesis, the greed hypothesis, has been broadly critiqued for paying insufficient attention to questions of context, history, social relations, and so on and so forth. And for me, in my work, I'm very much attracted to a political ecology approach, because it's very attentive to questions such as scale, identity, power relations, social relations, and the specificities of particular context. So a political ecology approach would suggest that the particular dynamics and causes of any particular resource-related conflict can only be understood by paying close attention to questions of context, power, identity, and so on. And I'll put it to you that um, extractive resource industries in countries such as Papua New Guinea and in Solomon Islands create a contentious politics that are fundamentally spatialized. And I should add here just a brief footnote, something that I should have mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, is that the economies of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands have been absolutely dominated by extractive resource industries over the past several decades. So in the case of Papua New Guinea, it's been mining and oil and gas, and to a lesser extent logging. And in the case of Solomon Islands, it has been logging and to a lesser extent mining. Now, I suggest that these sorts of projects produce these contentious politics that are fundamentally spatialized. And this is hardly surprising because large-scale resource extraction everywhere in the world is fundamentally about the politics of scale, right? What political and economic geographers refer to as the politics of scale, the scale of ownership and the scale of the distribution of the costs and benefits of something like a large-scale mine. And as I say, we see these politics of scale playing out wherever these large-scale extractive resource projects occur. So we see them in Australia. Equally, we see them in places like Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, and Solomon Islands. But what I will suggest is particular or specific to the ways in which these contentious spatialized politics play out in Melanesia, in the Western Pacific, is that we see the emergence of new or intensified territorializing and exclusionary ideologies and projects, right? And following the work of Michael Watts, who's done some amazing work on the political ecology of oil and violence in Nigeria, we might identify three governable spaces that have emerged in this encounter between extractive industries and Melanesian societies and histories. Okay, so these governable spaces are the space of customary land ownership, the space of islandism or indigeneity, and the space of nationalism. And what I will suggest is that, again, the encounter with extractive resource industries has produced contentious politics both within and between these three governable spaces, leading to a great deal of political fragmentation and indeed to violent contestation. Okay, so turning now to look at the Bougainville conflict, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about the ins and outs of the conflict, but what I will say briefly is that there was, I think scholars now would agree that there was a sense of pan-Bougainvillean identity, right? Bougainville has, I believe, 17 languages, but a long time before the advent of the giant Panguna copper mine from the late 1960s, there had already been the emergence of this Bougainville-wide identity, which had much to do with the introduction of capitalism, of capitalist social relations under colonialism. Okay, but scholars would also agree that the conflict, the full-scale secessionist conflict with Papua New Guinea, would not have happened were it not for the mine. But this is this has been, the respective roles of ethno-nationalism slash kind of identity on the one hand and the role of the mine on the other has been hotly contested. And there was a fellow by the name of Jim Griffin who suggested that the mine was largely irrelevant to the conflict. It was epiphenomenal, and the conflict was fundamentally an ethno-nationalist struggle. Okay, a bloke called Colin Filer, who's one of our colleagues here at the other hand, at the ANU, on the other hand, argues that The only thing that made Bougainville different to any of the other provinces in Papua New Guinea was the enormous mine in the middle of it, and that therefore it was the mine that was the fundamental cause of the conflict. Okay, well, who's right in this debate? Well, in many ways, they both are. And, in applying a kind of a political ecology framework, I'd argue that scale was a critical issue. So benefit sharing was the key issue at different scales. At the scale of customary land ownership, so at the scale of the customary landowning communities who were the mine affected communities, there was a lot of infighting around the distribution of benefits from the mine, royalties and rents, and so on. Benefit sharing was a critical issue within the space of the island itself. So between those landowners who were benefiting and other Bougainvilleans who weren't. And critically, it was a key source of tension between the provincial government of Bougainville and the national government of Papua New Guinea, because it was the latter, the national government of Papua New Guinea, that was capturing the lion's share of the benefits that were flowing from the mine. And let's make no mistake that those benefits were enormous. The Panguna copper mine, for the time that it operated, was the largest copper mine in the world, and the benefits which the government of Papua New Guinea was receiving very much set PNG up for independence in 1975. Okay, so we can see these factors locally at the scale of land ownership, social dislocation and disintegration caused by the distribution of the benefits from the mine. Phyla talks about the inability of landowning groups to absorb these benefits, and we see similar processes playing out around mines and other types of extractive industries throughout Melanesia.